The Kochs are modern America's most influential dynasty. Their paterfamilias. Fred C. Koch was a founding member of the John Birch Society, an anti-communist ultraconservative advocacy group associated with radical and far-right politics. It was thus jarring when it came out, decades after his demise, that Fred had once worked for Stalin and helped him modernize the Soviet Union's oil industry. A few years later he did the same for Hitler. Below are 20 things about that, and more dark aspects of other powerful historic families. America's most powerful dynasty. The Koch family is probably modern America's most powerful dynasty. They own Koch Industries, America's second biggest privately owned company with revenues of $115 billion in 2019. Politically active for decades, the Kochs have been generous patrons of conservative and libertarian causes and figures. More recently, the brothers David and Charles Koch have garnered widespread attention for heading a network of hundreds of libertarian and conservative think tanks, policy groups and candidates. The rise of the fiscally conservative Tea Party movement owed much to Koch's generosity. The dynasty's power was so great that in 2011, House Speaker John Boehner turned to David Koch when he needed votes to prevent a government shutdown. The Kochs have been key financial supporters of climate change skeptics. However, although staunchly libertarian and conservative, they have at times partnered with progressives. In 2015, for example, they worked with the American Civil Liberties Union on criminal justice reform, specifically on the issue of asset forfeiture. It goes without saying that the Kochs have been adamant opponents of communism, and all that has a whiff of socialism, as seen below. That did not stop the dynasty's founder from working for Joseph Stalin and helping him modernize the Soviet Union's oil industry. An anti-communist who made a bundle working for Stalin, then made another bundle working for Hitler. In 1925, Fred C. Koch, paterfamilias of the Koch dynasty, founded the Winkler Koch Engineering Company with an MIT classmate, and went into the oil business. When the duo lost a series of patent infringement lawsuits to bigger oil companies, they decided to seek their fortunes overseas. So they headed to the USSR, where they helped Stalin modernize the country's oil industry. They trained Soviet engineers and built 15 thermal cracking units to turn crude oil into gasoline. Fred became a radical anti-communist after Stalin purged his Soviet trainees, reneged on their deal, and deprived him of revenue. Stalin was not the only totalitarian dictator helped by Fred C. Koch. He worked with American Nazi William Rhodes Davis, who had personal ties with Adolf Hitler. Shortly after things went sour for him in the USSR, Fred headed to Germany, where he built the Hamburg oil refinery, the Third Reich's third biggest refinery. Fred admired the Nazis, and in a 1938 letter he wrote, "Although nobody agrees with me, I am of the opinion that the only sound countries in the world are Germany, Italy, and Japan, simply because they are all working and working hard." The Hamburg refinery was a big help to the Nazis as they swept through Europe, until it was finally taken out of action by Allied bombing in 1944. Dark as the Koch family's dark side might have been, at least it wasn't as dark as that of the other families below. The Kingmaker brothers, who ushered the decline of the Mughal dynasty. In the early 18th century, two Indian courtiers, the brothers Syed Hasan Ali Khan Bara and Syed Hussain Ali Khan, became powers behind the throne in the Mughal Empire. They appointed and deposed emperors as they saw fit, and ushered in the decline of the Mughal dynasty. The siblings became extremely influential when they were not outright ruling through puppet emperors, and dominated the Mughal realm until the early 1720s. They were born into a military family, sons of a general who faithfully served Emperor Aurangzeb, the last powerful and effective Mughal ruler. The Syed brothers followed in their father's footsteps, served as officers in the Mughal army, and grew steadily more influential in the Mughal court. However, they quit the court in high dudgeon over a slight by an imperial prince Jahandar. When Jahandar became emperor in 1712, the brothers remembered the slight. To pay him back, they backed one of his nephews, Farrukhsire, who rose up in rebellion against his uncle. With the Syed brothers' help, Farrukhsire defeated his uncle in 1713 and became Mughal emperor. Jahandar was captured, imprisoned and eliminated soon thereafter. The siblings who made and unmade emperors at will. To reward the Syed brothers, Farrukhsire appointed them to high positions in his court and government. However, the emperor's gratitude waned within a few years, and when he began to favor other courtiers over the Syeds, the relationship soured. Open warfare finally erupted in 1719, and the brothers won, deposed Farrukhsire, then imprisoned, blinded and ended him. They replaced Farouk's sire with Rafi-ad-Dirajat, a grandson of a previous emperor. The Sayyids then proceeded to rule the realm, with the new emperor as their puppet. It was a short-lived puppet show, however, and ended with the new emperor's demise within a few months. So the Sayyids elevated his younger brother, Rafi-ad-Dawla, to the throne, and continued to rule through their new puppet emperor. However, just like his brother, Rafi-ad-Dawla perished within a few months of ascending the throne, so the Sayyids picked a new emperor appointed by the brothers in 1719, Muhammad Shah. Unfortunately for the Sayyids, the new emperor was made of sterner stuff than his predecessors, and refused to act as anybody's puppet. Muhammad Shah had Sayyid Hussein Ali assassinated in 1720, then defeated his brother Hassan in 1722. After the latter gathered an army to avenge his brother, Sayyid Hassan was captured and executed in October of 1722. That finally ended the Sayyid brothers' Kingmaker era. By then, however, they had already inflicted permanent damage on the Mughal dynasty from which it never recovered. The powerful Saxon lord who made and unmade kings. For much of the first half of the 11th century, England was dominated by Godwin of Wessex, a nobleman who established the last Saxon dynasty. Although an Anglo-Saxon, Godwin won the favor of the Danish king Canute after the latter conquered England in 1016, and the new monarch made him Earl of Wessex in 1018. When Canute perished in 1035, his demise triggered a succession crisis. His son Harold Harefoot fought for the English throne against Alfred the Aetheling, son of Canute's predecessor, Ethelred the Unready. Godwin launched a kingmaker career and made his first king by securing the throne for Harold. To accomplish that, Godwin feigned loyalty to Alfred and lured him to London, where he was seized in an ambush. Alfred was then blinded and passed in captivity soon thereafter. However, Harold passed in 1040, and his heir was his half-brother Harthacnut, king of Denmark. That was awkward for Godwin, because Harthacnut also happened to be half-brother of that same Alfred whom Godwin had betrayed. The Earl of Wessex managed to worm his way out of Harthacnut's vengeance by claiming to have acted under Harold's orders. Between Godwin's protestations, his lavish gifts and offers to smooth his path to the English throne, Harthacnut let the Earl of Wessex off the hook. He limited his revenge to digging up and beheading Harold's corpse. The man who restored a Saxon dynasty after decades of Scandinavian rule. The passing of Harthacnut in 1042 triggered yet another succession crisis. This one was between King Magnus the Good of Norway and Edward the Confessor, Alfred's brother and the last surviving son of Athelred the Unready. Godwin played kingmaker once more and secured the throne for Edward. That restored to England the royal dynasty of Wessex and Saxon rule. After decades of Danish domination, Godwin became the most powerful nobleman in the court of Edward the Confessor. However, Kingmaker and King fell out in 1051 over Edward's increasing reliance on Norman advisors. The king had grown up in Normandy. Godwin was stripped of his earldom and banished, but he returned with an army, raised a rebellion, and set Edward the Confessor right. The king was forced to restore Godwin's earldom, and the Kingmaker became the most powerful man in the kingdom, until his sudden demise in 1053. His son Harold Godwinson succeeded him as England's most powerful figure, and was crowned king after Edward's end in 1066. He reigned until his defeat by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings later that year. The ruthless founder of a Judean dynasty. Augustus once remarked on how Herod the Great of Judea treated his offspring, with a quip, "I would rather be Herod's pig than his son." The Roman client king and founder of the Herodian dynasty that lasted until 92 AD built some massive projects, such as the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the fortress of Masada. However, he is best known from the Christian Gospels as the king who ordered the massacre of the innocents. When Jesus was born, his reign had started off well, but as it progressed, Herod grew paranoid about plots against him, some real, others imaginary. Those around Herod manipulated his fears, and he often lashed out violently. The victims of his wrath included members of his own family. Herod was born to an Edomite father, from a people who had been forcibly converted to Judaism only a generation or two before Herod's birth. However, he was raised as a nominal Jew, and he married into the ruling Jewish Hasmonean dynasty, tying the knot with Princess Mariamne, one of the last Hasmonean heirs. He then disposed of her relatives to remove contenders for the throne of Judea, and got the Romans to make him king of the Jews. Understandably, that gave Mariamne plenty of cause to resent her husband. As seen below, that did not turn out well for Mariamne. It also did not turn out well for two of her sons with Herod. Alexander and Aristobulus, who resented their father's treatment of their mother. A great king's great problems at home. Mariamne was a stunning beauty, and Herod was crazy about her, but not in a good way. On the one hand, he was passionately in love with her; on the other hand, he was also crazy jealous. While Herod loved Mariamne, she did not feel the same. It was probably understandable, since Herod had eliminated her brother and uncle. Also, Herod's father had ended Mariamne's father, then embalmed him in a tub of honey. Nonetheless, Herod had 5 children with her, 2 girls and 3 boys. Herod might have been crazy in love with Mariamne, but considering how many of her relatives Herod had disposed of, she could not bring herself to love him back. Eventually, after she gave birth to their 5th child, Mariamne stopped having intimate relations with him. That fueled his suspicions that she was cheating on him. Herod's mother and sister fanned those suspicions, and added to the accusations that Mariamne planned to poison him. Eventually, Herod ordered Mariamne executed in 29 BC. That was bad enough, but things soon went from bad to grotesque. To say that the founder of this dynasty had a messed up family life would be to understate things. Although he had ordered Mariamne's execution, Herod exhibited intense grief for her passing. He often broke into uncontrollable fits of sobbing, went into a deep depression, and was unable to let her go. That is, he was literally unable to let her go. According to the Talmud, Herod had his dead wife's body preserved in honey, and he continued to make love to the corpse for 7 whole years. The Talmud described it as Herod fulfilling his animalistic desires with the cadaver. It wasn't just icky, but also sticky. Herod had supposedly preserved Mariamne's corpse with honey. Understandably, Herod's children by Mariamne resented the fact that he had ordered their mother to be put down, or that he had continued to get it on with her corpse, so they grew up with a fractious relationship with their father. Two in particular, Alexander and Aristobulus, did a poor job of hiding their resentment of Herod. That led him to suspect them of plotting against him to avenge their mother, so Herod imprisoned Alexander in 10 BC, and 3 years later had him and his brother Aristobulus charged with treason. Both were convicted, and Herod ordered his son strangled in 7 BC, giving rise to Augustus' quip that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son. History's most bizarre dynasty. Few ruling families have been as dysfunctional, perverse, or given to more intrafamilial crime than the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt from 323 to 30 BC. All 15 kings were named Ptolemy, numbered I through 15, and of the Ptolemaic queens were 7 Cleopatras and 4 Berenices. The family had a tradition of interfamily marriages, mostly with brothers marrying sisters, with the occasional uncle, niece, and nephew-aunt weddings. There was also at least one possible mother-son marriage thrown into the mix. In addition to marrying their close relatives, they were also into eliminating each other. The dynasty's history abounds with Ptolemies ending their brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews, and even mothers. The dynasty was founded by Ptolemy, a Soter, Greek for Ptolemy the Savior, a Macedonian general and close companion of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's demise, Ptolemy was one of 3 Diadochi or successors, who carved up Alexander's empire amongst themselves. Ptolemy took Egypt as his share. There he founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, until Queen Cleopatra VII's demise and the annexation of Egypt to the Roman Empire in 30 BC. Ptolemy was born out of wedlock to a concubine presented by a nobleman to King Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. Ptolemy's father is unknown, and some ancient sources claim that his mother was already pregnant when she was gifted to Philip II. Others assert that it was Philip who impregnated her, which would make Ptolemy the biological half-brother of Alexander the Great. The founder of this dynasty hijacked Alexander the Great's corpse. Alexander the Great met his end unexpectedly in Babylon in 323 BC, and there was no clear successor who could take over his massive empire, so his chief generals began to jockey for slices of the dead conqueror's power and territory, and each vied to carve out his own realm and found his own dynasty. In the resultant struggle, the deceased monarch's mortal remains became valuable chips in a deadly power game. Alexander might have shuffled off the mortal coil, but in the political context of the time, his corpse was a valuable item. Burying a king was a royal prerogative, so possession of King Alexander's body symbolized legitimacy. As a result, the corpse stayed in Babylon for over a year, while people figured out what to do with it. Alexander, who came to believe that he was the son of the god Ammon, had wanted to be buried in the temple of Zeus Ammon in the Egyptian desert. That was unacceptable to Alexander's generals, who eventually decided to send his body to the traditional royal burial ground in Macedon. The corpse was placed in a giant coffin, that was placed in a ginormous funerary carriage, and sent on a stately procession from Babylon to Macedon. However, Alexander never made it back home. His corpse got hijacked along the way. The great conqueror's corpse was vitally important for the prestige of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Alexander the Great's key lieutenants had worked out a preliminary rough division of his empire amongst themselves. By the time the great conqueror's corpse began its journey back home, one of them, Ptolemy, ended up with Egypt as his share. He decided that the prestige of his new realm and dynasty would be greatly enhanced if it hosted the body of Alexander, specifically in the city of Alexandria, founded by and named after the great conqueror. So Ptolemy set out to hijack the great conqueror's corpse. In 321 BC he intercepted Alexander's funerary procession, seized the body and took it back to Egypt. Ptolemy and his Ptolemaic dynasty successors built and maintained an impressive mausoleum for Alexander in Alexandria. It became one of the city's biggest attractions. Over the centuries, powerful figures such as Julius Caesar, Augustus and other Roman emperors stopped by to pay their respects. Augustus accidentally broke Alexander's nose, while other emperors pilfered mementos from the coffin. Over time, however, interest in the mausoleum waned. In 400 AD, a visitor noted that the Alexandrians did not know where Alexander's tomb was. In the centuries since, there were scattered reports by visitors who claimed to have seen Alexander's tomb, but without enough specificity to allow archaeologists to pinpoint a location. As of 2022, Alexander the Great's final resting place is one of history's unsolved mysteries. This dynasty got started on a tradition of inter-family relations early on. Ptolemy I, the first ruler and founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was a capable general. He had learned from and served under one of history's greatest military geniuses, Alexander the Great. His son and successor, Ptolemy II, did not inherit his father's military chops. He opted instead for peaceful and cultural pursuits, patronized scientific research, and expanded the great library of Alexandria. In his reign, the Ptolemaic court in Alexandria reached a height of splendor that would not be seen again. Another distinction of the second Ptolemy is that he was nicknamed Philadelphos, lover of his sister. It was because he took sibling affection to lengths hitherto alien to Greeks and Macedonians, but common among Egyptian royals. He had initially been married to Arsinoe, the daughter of King Lysimachus of Thrace, who was also married to Ptolemy II's sister Arsinoe II, which made Lysimachus his father-in-law as well as brother-in-law. After Lysimachus' demise, Ptolemy II got rid of the Thracian king's daughter, Arsinoe, and married his own sister, the widowed Arsinoe II, and kicked off a tradition of Ptolemaic inbreeding that lasted for centuries, until the dynasty finally fell. The first of the Ptolemaic dynasty to dispose of his own mother. The rotten track record of depravity that became hallmarks of the Ptolemaic dynasty began when Ptolemy II married his own sister. The introduction of that tradition of marrying within the family into the dynasty had long-lasting consequences. It ultimately produced a long line of unfit rulers, and transformed the Ptolemies into objects of ridicule among Hellenistic and Roman contemporaries. People in the family marrying each other was arguably eclipsed, however, by Ptolemy IV, who added intrafamilial crime to the Ptolemaic dynasty's repertoire when he eliminated his own mother, Berenice II. Ptolemy IV ascended the throne as co-ruler. Alongside his mother, she was a formidable woman who had once stemmed a battlefield rout when she mounted a horse, rallied her side's surviving troops, and led them in a countercharge that seized victory from the jaws of defeat. Feeling intimidated and wanting to rule alone, Ptolemy IV inaugurated his reign by eliminating his mother. Despite that act of ruthlessness, he was a weak-willed ruler who was dominated by his mistress and court favorites, and an airhead who devoted himself to religious rituals, while Ptolemy IV devoted himself to fluff. Egypt was racked by serious rebellions that took decades to suppress. He also married his own sister Arsinoe III, who gave birth to his heir Ptolemy V. The start of Ptolemaic decline. When Ptolemy IV passed in 204 BC, his son and heir, Ptolemy V, was too young to rule in his own right. Power was thus supposed to go to the child king's mother/aunt Arsinoe III, who was to rule as regent. However, that arrangement went awry when some of the former king's courtiers, who had gotten used to dominating the weak-willed Ptolemy IV, they feared that they would lose their influence, and perhaps their lives, if Arsinoe assumed power, so they beat her to the punch, offed her, and took the regency for themselves. The new regents were themselves eliminated soon thereafter, one of them lynched on the street by an Alexandrian mob. In the aftermath, the Kingdom of Egypt grew increasingly unstable, the other Hellenistic kingdoms took advantage of the chaos along the Nile, and the Seleucids and Macedonians made a pact to divvy up the Ptolemaic kingdom. The dynasty would have come to an inglorious end, if not for the intervention of a rising power from the other side of the Mediterranean, Rome. With the Ptolemaic dynasty in disarray, neighbors were quick to take advantage. With Egypt in disarray and ruled by the child king Ptolemy V, neighbors took notice and decided to exploit the situation. Kings Philip V of Macedon and Antiochus III the Great of Seleucia entered into an agreement to seize and divide amongst themselves the Ptolemaic kingdom's possessions. Accordingly, Philip V took the Egyptian kingdom's holdings in Thrace and Asia Minor, while Antiochus the Great plucked Judea and Coel Syria, a region stretching northeast from Lebanon through Syria to the Euphrates River. Things got worse for the Ptolemies when Ptolemy V was succeeded in 181 BC by his son Ptolemy VI. He was another child ruler who reigned as a figurehead, while power was exercised by courtiers. When the new monarch's regents demanded the return of Coel Syria in 170 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV beat them to the punch. He launched a preemptive strike. With a lightning invasion of Egypt in 169 BC, the Egyptians were routed, and Antiochus IV captured Alexandria and seized Ptolemy VI, whom he allowed to remain on the throne as a puppet ruler. It took the Romans to save the Ptolemaic dynasty from an early collapse. As the power of the Ptolemaic dynasty declined in the eastern Mediterranean, that of the Roman Republic rose in the western Mediterranean and the Aegean. Rome would ultimately gobble up Egypt and extinguish the Ptolemaic kingdom, but in the 2nd century BC Rome came to Egypt's rescue in a big way, and saved the Ptolemies from the depredations of Antiochus IV. In 168 BC the Seleucid king launched a second invasion of Egypt, that once again routed the Egyptians. Antiochus' invasion was stopped in its tracks by a single Roman envoy, Gaius Popilius Linas, who met the invading army a few miles out of Alexandria. Linas told Antiochus that the Roman Senate demanded that he abort his attack and return to his kingdom. When Antiochus played for time and sought to consult his advisors, Linas used a stick to draw a circle in the sand around the Seleucid monarch, and told him not to step out of it until he gave an answer. By then Rome had routed the Carthaginians, the Macedonians overran Greece and was running rampant all over the Mediterranean. Antiochus IV decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and immediately turned his army around and marched out of Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty was saved. But from then on the Ptolemies would continue on as Rome's client kings and puppets. A brother who married his sister and eliminated her son during the wedding feast. The Seleucid invasions of Egypt and resultant political and diplomatic machinations further added to the chaos that engulfed the Ptolemaic dynasty in its realm. When Antiochus IV captured Alexandria and made Ptolemy VI his puppet, the people of Alexandria rioted and chose the puppet king's obese younger brother, Ptolemy VIII Physcon, or Ptolemy Potbelly, as monarch. After the Seleucids were forced out of Egypt by Roman threats, Ptolemy Potbelly agreed to a three-way joint rule with his brother Ptolemy VI and their sister Cleopatra II, who was also Ptolemy VI's wife. It was an unstable arrangement that lent itself to intrigues, conspiracies and betrayals, and further destabilized Egypt. Ptolemy Potbelly was not in Egypt when Ptolemy VI perished in 145. Their sister Cleopatra II, the deceased king's wife, promptly declared her son Ptolemy VII as king. When Potbelly returned, he convinced his widowed sister to marry him instead, and the sibling spouses would rule jointly. He double-crossed his sister/new wife and her son. Ptolemy VII ended during the wedding feast. He also reneged on his promise to rule jointly with his sister-wife and declared himself sole ruler. Ptolemaic dynasty's rot deepens. Unsurprisingly, Queen Cleopatra II was hopping mad that her husband-brother, King Ptolemy Potbelly, had taken her son and reneged on his promise to share the rule with her. Then Potbelly made things worse when he seduced and married Cleopatra II's daughter Cleopatra III. She was his stepdaughter, as well as double niece, being the daughter of both his sister and his deceased brother Ptolemy VI. To add insult to injury, Potbelly did not bother to divorce Cleopatra II before he married her daughter. In retaliation, Cleopatra II engineered a revolt in Alexandria that forced her brother husband-son-in-law and his stepdaughter niece/wife to flee the city in 132 BC. The resultant civil dispute pitted Cleopatra II, supported by the city of Alexandria, against her daughter and Ptolemy Potbelly, who was backed by the rest of Egypt. When things turned against Cleopatra II, she offered her throne to the neighboring Seleucids, but their armies were unable to rescue her, and she was forced to flee to Syria in 127 BC. Chaos reigned in Egypt, until Rome intervened once again in 116 BC to restore order. Mothers aren't supposed to have favorite children, but this mother surely did. Ptolemaic family intrigues complicated the reign of Ptolemy IX Soter II, nicknamed Lathyros, chickpea. By then marrying siblings was an established family tradition in the Ptolemaic dynasty, and this Ptolemy married his sister Cleopatra IV sometime before he became king. When his father Ptolemy VIII Potbelly passed in 116 BC, his mother and the reigning queen Cleopatra III made him co-regent. However, it seems that Ptolemy IX had not been her favorite son, and that she had been forced to choose him because of public pressure from the citizens of Alexandria. She worked out some of that resentment by forcing Ptolemy IX in 115 BC to divorce his sister-wife Cleopatra IV and replace her with her own sister, Ptolemy IX's aunt, Cleopatra Selene. Ptolemy IX's sister and ex-wife fled Egypt to the neighboring Hellenistic Seleucid kingdom, where she married King Antiochus IX and became queen consort in 114 BC. Her reign proved brief, however, as her husband was defeated and deposed by a half-brother. Cleopatra IV sought sanctuary in a temple, but soldiers followed her in and eliminated her there. As to Ptolemy IX, Cleopatra III accused her son and co-regent of having tried to plot to have her eliminated, and deposed him in 107 BC. His place was taken by his brother and Cleopatra III's favorite son, Alexander, who ascended the throne as Ptolemy X.